So, what's the latest on the US-Iran negotiations today? Vicente made a statement at the White House today, and I have a very clear opinion on this issue that I want to share with everyone. Also, California will be holding its primary in 6 days, on June 2nd. What's really catching people's attention right now is both the governor's race and the Los Angeles mayoral race. There could be a dark horse in either race, someone who wins the primary and moves on to the November general election. In response to this situation, the California legislature has introduced a new election law specifically for the primary that's happening in 6 days. You wouldn't believe what this new election law is like. So today, I want to talk to everyone about this, and I definitely want to hear your thoughts. This is yet another bizarre American bill that's breaking new ground. And then there's Russia. Wow, yesterday they suddenly attacked Romania. What kind of chain reaction will that set off? Welcome to Good Morning America, brought to you by Fangway. Hello to all our viewers on YouTube and listeners on Sound of Hope, Silicon Valley FM 96.1. If this is your first time watching the show, please subscribe. With so much information out there these days, you don't have to chase after all kinds of media yourself every day. After you subscribe, we'll help you sort through and analyze the important news and also explain the reasoning behind the headlines. So just by coming here, you can quickly get a handle on the news about America and related topics that really matter. We also want to thank our longtime viewers for sticking with us. And to our loyal audience, please remember to share the show with friends who care about current events so more Chinese people can gain new perspectives together. All right, let's get right into the main topic. Today, U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent hosted the White House press briefing, which is actually quite an interesting situation. As you know, the White House press secretary, Leavitt, is currently on maternity leave. While she's away, the White House hasn't appointed an official acting spokesperson. Instead, they've had different cabinet secretaries take turns hosting the briefings. The second day, it was Rubio, right? Then it was Vance, and today it's Bessent's turn. So it's pretty interesting. Does Trump really not like Leavitt that much? Even while Leavitt is on maternity leave, he doesn't bother to find a replacement. He just tells his top officials, you all take turns until Leavitt comes back. That's basically the situation. All right, so when Bessent came up, the very first question was, of course, about Iran. So how did he talk about the current situation with Iran? Let me first share some related news. Yesterday, reports came in that U.S. officials said the U.S. and Iran had reached a provisional agreement in their negotiations. However, President Trump hasn't signed off on it yet, and it's also unclear whether Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, sometimes jokingly called Erha, has agreed to it either. Has he approved it as well? So, of course, the signatures of both men are absolutely essential and an indispensable step. As for the content of the agreement, the media is now reporting that this is just a memorandum of understanding. It's called a Memorandum of Understanding, which basically means a letter of intent. It will include provisions for lifting the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Both sides will lift the blockade. In addition, it will allow ships to navigate freely, and it will also initiate a 60-day negotiation period to address Iran's nuclear program. This also includes the fate of the stockpile of highly enriched material. If that's the case, as you know, it's pretty much what I predicted about a week or 10 days ago. Both sides lift the blockade, and then, well, the nuclear issue will be discussed further. That's basically the situation. Regarding Iran's frozen assets, the spokesperson for the Iranian delegation said that Iran has successfully managed to get about half of its frozen assets unfrozen, which is around $12 billion out of a total of $24 billion. They will put this in the menu. In short, the whole thing is that the most difficult and tricky issues are being sidestepped, and the tough problems are being postponed for later. But is that really the case? We'll talk about that in a bit. Right now, reporters are asking whether the agreement is already on the table between the U.S. and Iran. Treasury Secretary Bessent said that both sides have been in communication, and the president has made it very clear that he has a few red lines. Iran must hand over its highly enriched uranium, and they cannot develop nuclear weapons. In addition, the Strait of Hormuz must remain open for free passage. And as we all know about Iran, yesterday I mentioned that the chairman of Iran's Parliamentary Security Committee said that Iran's red line is that they absolutely will not hand over their highly enriched uranium. And they insist on maintaining the right to continue enriching highly enriched uranium, plus they insist on controlling the Strait of Hormuz. So regardless of what officials said yesterday, this or that, in my view, in my opinion, I see zero common ground between the two sides. Lifting the double blockade could be considered a point of overlap, but for Trump, lifting the double blockade is conditional on resolving the nuclear issue first. If the nuclear issue isn't resolved, the U.S. blockade won't be lifted. So just like President Trump said, he won't accept a bad deal. If there's going to be a deal, it has to be a good one. So right now, you could say that the most fundamental parts of this agreement, The red lines for both sides are still as far apart as the Grand Canyon in Colorado. That's how big the gap is. So after all this talking up to now, I personally think there's zero common ground. Nothing has come out of these talks. There's really nothing you can count on, is there? Let's see, maybe I'm wrong, okay? But this is how I see things right now. At the same time, a couple of days ago, some people were saying that Iran and Oman were teaming up to split control of the Strait of Hormuz. Well, Bashenti said that the US government will not tolerate any attempt to set up a toll system for passage through the Strait of Hormuz. And he specifically called out Oman. President Trump already said at yesterday's cabinet meeting, hey, Oman, if you try to charge fees, I'm going to blow you up. I'll bomb you, destroy you. So then the Treasury Secretary, the Treasury Department, issued a statement yesterday. Anyone who tries to charge fees directly or indirectly will be sanctioned. So yesterday, the Omani ambassador called Bassett. Through the call, the ambassador assured Bassett that Oman, whether you call it Oman or Oman, depending on the translation, but let's just say Oman. Oman has no plans to charge transit fees for the strait. He said, our two countries have had over 200 years of good relations. That is the US and Oman. Wow, the US and Oman have had over 200 years of good relations. What's up with that? Is that really the case? Anyway, regardless, he said we wouldn't risk upsetting the Omani people. The risk of economic or financial sanctions, in other words, Iran pulling Oman into this alliance to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, right now it's either just wishful thinking or it's like taking 2 steps and then stopping. At the same time, Iranian state media said yesterday that a U.S. warplane was shot down. Today, U.S. Central Command confirmed that no American aircraft have been shot down. All U.S. air assets, all fighter jets are safe and sound. So Iran is just talking nonsense again. Also, as for the Treasury Department, another piece of news is that preparations have already been made to issue a new $250 bill featuring President Trump's portrait. So what's going on with this? This is actually a bill proposed by the House of Representatives. So about the House of Representatives, there's a federal congressman from South Carolina named Joe Wilson. Joe Wilson proposed that the U.S. Treasury Department's Bureau of Engraving and Printing, he called it the Bureau of Craving and Printing, but it's actually the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, should handle this. To issue a commemorative $250 bill featuring Trump's portrait to celebrate the 250th anniversary of America's founding this year. But actually, according to U.S. law, it's currently prohibited to print the portrait of a living person on currency. So the bill that's been proposed is actually hoping to create an exception for President Trump. Reporters asked Besson about the details of this bill, and Besson did confirm that the portrait on it would be Donald Trump. But he said that ultimately, everything depends on Congress. He said, we will abide by the law. So is this really possible? What do you think? Will Congress pass it? Even if the House passes it, will the Senate pass it? If the Democrats use a filibuster to block it, then basically it's a no-go, right? So I don't think it's very likely. But anyway, you can see that there are always people trying to make a breakthrough in this area, or to give President Trump some special recognition. All right, and since we're talking about basing, of course, we have to mention economic issues and oil prices. So the reporter said that the average price of gas across the U.S. is now over $4 per gallon, which means that people are generally worried about oil supply and prices. It will likely continue to stay high or even increase. But he said that oil prices might drop soon. He said that, in fact, we saw oil prices fall by about 10% in May. And right now, there are nearly 2,000 ships waiting to leave the Gulf. He's talking about the Persian Gulf. He said, in his opinion, after this situation, the oil market supply will be very sufficient and prices might drop quickly. Of course, let me add my own comment here. If the war ends, then of course prices will drop quickly. But if the war doesn't end, the market will still adjust. As you all know, Saudi Arabia and many Gulf countries are now starting to go across the Arabian Peninsula. That is, they're moving. Oil is being transported through pipelines to the ports on the Red Sea side, where it's loaded onto ships for export. In addition, there's also a land pipeline on the southern shore of the Strait of Hormuz. This oil is transported overland from one end of the strait to the outside of the strait, where it's then loaded onto ships. Also, all the oil-producing countries are ramping up extraction, especially the United States and Venezuela, both of which are increasing their output. In addition, the UAE has already withdrawn from OPEC and is also boosting its production. So basically, whenever oil prices go up, the first thing that happens is an immediate increase in production, right? Yeah, if the situation Of course, prices will drop quickly if the situation eases. If things don't calm down, oil prices will also gradually fall. That's how things stand right now. The only question is whether this can happen in time for the midterm elections. All right, next, I'm going to talk to you about another topic, which is about this matter. I think, well, we can try to estimate how much the American public cares about gas prices and how that might affect the midterm elections. I want to ask our viewers, if during the midterm elections, gas prices in the US stay above $4, would that affect your support for either the Democrats or the Republicans in the midterms? In other words, if gas prices stay high, would you be less willing to vote for President Trump? That's what I mean. When I say President Trump, I mean voting for the Republican Party, since Trump represents the Republicans. Or would you still vote for them anyway? Let's do a poll and see, okay? Now, let me tell you about something in California that really surprised me. This new bill really struck me. It's bizarre, so listen closely. I'll explain it in detail as it involves the principles behind how the American political system operates and its original intent. I can give everyone a detailed explanation about this, but before I get into that, let me quickly mention something. Our viewer, Miss Lee, is from Virginia. She's 64 years old this year and has worked in pharmaceutical research for a long time. Not long ago, she had a dental procedure involving 3 teeth. The procedure was done in 2 stages. Before the first surgery, she hadn't eaten any red sea cucumber, and her recovery afterward was pretty slow. The whole process was quite tough. But before the second surgery, she had already eaten more than 20 pieces, and on the day of the surgery, she even made a point to eat 1 more. So what happened this time? Her recovery process was much easier than expected, and she was really surprised by this change, which made her even more confident. She said, wow, now she keeps buying more. Why was there such a big difference? Because after oral surgery, the body enters a stage of tissue repair and regeneration, and during this period, the demand for collagen and nutrients for connective tissue is especially high. This red sea cucumber is wild caught from Jeju Island in South Korea. It uses a patented Korean low-enzyme, low-temperature enzymatic hydrolysis technology, which can fully preserve and break down into small molecules the 3 key components: variable collagen, multi-chain chondroitin sulfate, and sea cucumber saponins. These are basically destroyed when sea cucumbers are cooked using traditional high-temperature methods. But by processing it this way, not only does it avoid destroying these components, it also breaks them down into smaller molecules, making them easier to absorb. So if you often feel tired, have low energy, or your sleep quality isn't great, you might want to try supplementing with this. Right now, if you enter the promo code FANGWEI, you can get a 15% discount. If you sign up for a monthly plan, starting from the 2nd month, you'll get a 20% discount. And the longer you subscribe, the bigger the discount. That's how it works. For more details, just click the description below to learn more. All right, so California's primary is on June 2nd. June 2nd is a really important election day. Why? Because there are 2 major races. One is for governor. There's a Republican candidate for governor named Steve Hilton. I've actually interviewed him before. He's really come out of nowhere, even though he's been around for quite a while. He was actually leading in the polls for a while, but now he's in 2nd place. Still, he's clearly in 2nd. In California's primary, it's nonpartisan. Everyone should know this. The top 2 vote getters, regardless of party, move on to the November 3rd general election. So if things keep going this way, Stephen Hilton, as a Republican, has a good chance of making it into the November general election. What if he actually wins? California has a pendulum effect. When it swings far enough, voters might decide they've had enough and try a Republican. If so, Steve Hilton will be ready. Also, there's something else truly bizarre. I don't know how many of our viewers or listeners know about this. 2 years ago, there was a huge fire in Los Angeles. It was a real mess. It burned down a whole area where some of the wealthiest people lived. The name is a bit long, but I think of it as Paradise Town. Yeah, the whole place was burned down. So what happened? After the fire, there was this one guy. His name is Spencer Pratt. He waited for a whole year, but his house still couldn't be rebuilt. He was really angry. So in the end, about a year ago, he announced he was running for mayor of Los Angeles. Basically, he was saying, if you can't solve the problem, then I'll do it myself. So what happened? A few days ago, he made a series of videos using AI. In these videos, he used Star Wars scenes to simulate the California election. casting California's establishment as the Emperor from the evil empire in Star Wars, and also as the Dark Lord. What's his name? The guy in black armor. That's the situation. In short, the production was really flashy. He played himself as Batman, basically making a commercial that was like a short film. As a result, it went viral. Now his poll numbers have risen to second place. So on June 2nd, it's very likely he'll break through. If things keep going after June 2nd, who will be his main opponent in the election? It's the current mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass. In other words, Pratt will go up against Bass, and if there are still 4 or 5 months left to fight for the final election. Because Bass right now is really carrying a heavy burden in terms of public opinion, a lot of negative baggage. She could actually lose and hand over the position of Los Angeles mayor to someone whose house was burned down. So in light of this situation, that's what makes the California primary on June 2nd so interesting to watch. Both the governor and the mayor of the biggest city might be replaced, or at least there's a real possibility of that happening. So in a state like California, where the Democratic Party holds an overwhelming advantage, could these two things really happen? We'll find out on May 27th. The California state legislature urgently passed a state bill that takes effect immediately, and it's pretty clear this is aimed at the June 2nd primary. The passage of this bill also means that the third battleground of the U.S. elections has officially opened. What does that mean? What do I mean by third battleground? Actually, that's a term I made up myself, just something I came up with. Listen and see if what I say makes sense to you. The first battleground is the electoral map, the nationwide map battle that I often talk about with everyone. The second is voter ID, which is marked by the Save America Act, whether or not they actually check who you are when you vote. The third is what happens on election day itself. This battleground is about the election procedures, the voting process, and the equipment used for voting and counting votes. So what's really going on here? Let me first give everyone some background. How is the 2026 election different from the elections in 2022, 2024, or even 2020? Because this year, the election is being held under Trump's administration of the federal government. According to the Constitution, the president is not only the highest executive officer, not only the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and by the way, the U.S. doesn't just have 3 branches of the military, it actually has 6, but also the highest law enforcement officer in the country. Okay, you might ask, isn't the highest law enforcement officer the Attorney General? Well, no, that's not the case. The Attorney General is just the specific top law enforcement officer, but the president is fundamentally the highest official in law. The highest law enforcement officer is actually the president. So even though elections are organized by each state, but if there are issues of systematic election fraud, of course the federal government can step in. So no state can just do whatever it wants, running everything behind closed doors. The president today has the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the National Guard at his disposal. They can be on the ground to monitor things. So if you commit fraud, of course the federal government can step in. They won't let you pull any tricks. And this is even without election reform. Even if the Safe American Act hasn't passed, the federal government can still supervise and take action. Actually, in 2020, Trump could have done this too, but for 2 reasons he didn't. First, no one expected such a huge issue would come up with the election itself. Honestly, they were completely caught off guard. In the middle of the night, when there was a sudden spike in ballots, they really had no idea how to respond. Second, at that time, the Attorney General, the FBI director, and law enforcement officials across the country, even though they were appointed by Trump, didn't necessarily listen to him. Why? Because even they themselves were wondering if something this big could really happen. The first issue is whether they believed it or not, and second, even if they knew something really happened, would they be willing to do anything about it? So basically, it was like an ambush, and you could say Trump ended up losing that battle. That's why I keep saying, in 2016, Hillary ran into an ambush she was completely unprepared for. She was misled by the mainstream polls into thinking she would easily win that election. In the end, she underestimated the huge grassroots support for Trump, and as a result, she lost that ambush, and Trump won that presidential election. In 2020, Trump himself ran into an ambush he wasn't fully prepared for. He encountered all sorts of strange things in the election industry, and he simply didn't have the resources or the mindset to handle them urgently. All right, but by 2026, both sides are fully prepared. Remember, by 2024, they were already fully prepared, but in 2026, Trump is holding the federal government in his hands. So now, this brings about a new round of complications, what I call the third battlefield. The reason for opening up this new front, that's the big picture here. So what am I talking about? The third battlefield is the issue of voting on election day, from the procedures to the use of equipment. Let's first talk about the procedures. Last year, on April 1st, Trump signed an executive order allowing the federal government to collect voter rolls from all the states. By having the voter rolls from each state in his own hands, if there are any questions, the post office, under Trump's control, can simply not count those ballots. Because in many states, actually almost all states, they use early voting, right? Early voting. All the states use the U.S. Post Office, which is called the U.S. Post Office in English. This is a postal unit under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Well, because Trump has no way right now, there's no way to conduct a fundamental verification through the Save America Act. So elections are run by each state, and he can't directly intervene in state elections, so he goes through the postal system. He manages things through the postal route. What does that mean? Basically, he says the post office is under his control, so he collects the list himself. If he thinks someone is questionable, he just won't process it for you. If he doesn't process it, you won't receive your ballot, right? So doesn't that make this, what do you call it? If he thinks someone is problematic, then that person can't vote. So what happens if you can't vote? The very next day, on April 2nd, the Democrats took him to court. Yesterday, the federal court made a ruling. What was the ruling? I'll talk about that in a moment. This is an issue with the voting process. Now let me talk about the issue with the voting equipment. So now the second issue is this. California recently passed a new law on May 27th called SB73. SB stands for Senate Bill, so it's Senate Bill 73. So what does it say? The regulation states that in California elections, listen to me here, California elections do not allow unauthorized law enforcement personnel to inspect voting machines. Okay, so the specific language says it prohibits election officials, this refers to California, prohibits California election officials from allowing federal government agencies and their employees to inspect voting system machines or equipment unless they have authorization from a federal court. What does that mean? This is basically a big version of resistance to voter ID. As we all know, California passed a law the year before last, which says that if any local government in California, any county or city, disagrees with the state government's policy of not checking voter ID and decides to implement voter ID checks for their own city's elections, that's not allowed. This is exactly what happened in Huntington Beach in Southern California, where the city made such a rule. As a result, the state legislature stepped in and said this was illegal, and even passed a specific law stating that if a local government wants to check voter ID on its own, that's illegal. They want to check, which is such a good thing, but they say it's illegal. So this is that super bizarre California law from a couple of years ago, and now they're taking this concept, this logic, and applying it even more broadly to all the voting machines across the entire state. In other words, the voting machines we're using, nobody is allowed to inspect them. If you try, it's illegal. Even California officials don't allow the federal government to check them. So when you look at this and then see California passing laws to block it, isn't this just another round of California's really, really strange phenomena? And that's not all. Because the situation was urgent, the California state legislature, which is controlled by the Democrats, took a special action. They took a bill that was introduced back in January 2025 about vehicle travel in very low traffic areas, which would exempt certain requirements of California's Environmental Protection Act, a bill that had absolutely nothing to do with the current issue. And in January of this year, they completely gutted its contents. They threw out everything about vehicle travel and stuffed in all these things we just talked about, turning it into today's so-called election bill that prohibits checking voting machines. And in English, it's called Elections Inspection of Voting Systems, basically a bill about inspecting election voting systems. Why did they do this? Because if they introduced a brand new bill and went through the whole process from scratch, it would take a lot longer. For example, in California, after a bill is introduced, it has to be posted for a certain number of days so everyone can review it before it can be voted on, but there just isn't enough time because, as you know, the primary election is only 6 days away. If you follow the normal procedure, there just isn't enough time. So what they do is take a bill that's already halfway through the process and already has a bill number and just use that. They gut the original content and put in something new, tossing out everything from before. It's like swapping out the real thing for a fake one. This way, they can push things through quickly. Yeah, so in the end, the vote definitely went along party lines. All the Republicans opposed it, and every Democrat supported it. Since the Democrats have a supermajority, it passed. So it passed the Assembly on January 27th, then the Senate on May 27th, and Governor Newsom signed it right away. It was passed just 6 days before the primary, on May 27th. Simply put, the voting machines we use in the primary are not allowed to be inspected by the federal government. So, in this situation, what kind of impact does this have on Steve Hilton and Spencer Pratt, who I just mentioned? One is running for governor and the other for mayor of Los Angeles. What do you all think? Please leave a comment to share your opinions with the public, okay? Many of our viewers are California voters, so please share your opinions. Let's build our own circle of public discourse. Honestly, it's pretty bizarre, but the question is, does it actually work? They say the federal government isn't allowed to inspect the voting machines, but will the federal government really just back off and not check them? The federal government backs down in the face of difficulties. There's absolutely no way they won't get involved. Why? Because as the highest law enforcement officer in the country, how could Trump just ignore it? Plus, from the federal government's perspective, this California law is just them talking to themselves. Isn't this basically admitting there's something fishy going on? So, will this attract a lot of attention from the federal government? Absolutely. So, on the day of voting, during the October 3rd voting period, is it possible that we might see a standoff between federal law enforcement and California law enforcement over the voting machines, with tensions running high? It's possible if the federal government decides to get involved. I'm not saying the feds will definitely step in. I do think it will definitely raise their awareness and concern, but whether they'll actually send people to seize the voting machines and end up in a confrontation, well, that's possible. In any case, at the very least, this involves the California primary that's just 6 days away. So no matter what the polls say, it doesn't matter. In the end, the election is about the election itself and whether the election process is trustworthy. Without a doubt, that alone completely determines the outcome of the election, doesn't it?